What is classicism in music? Now, to understand this, I have structured the session into 4 segments. Before we understand classicism, let us define what is classical music. The word classical has 2 different meanings in music. In the broader sense, classical music refers to music of certain forms and musical genres, such as the symphony, sonata, or chamber music, for certain instrumental combinations, such as the solo violin, orchestra, or string quartet, and these are intended for concert performance. In a narrower sense, the word classical refers to a specific period in music history and specific sets of stylistic traits. This is the dominant music style from the mid-18th to early 19th century in Europe. What does the music of the classical period mean to you? To appreciate the meaning of the word classical, we need to dive our eyes into the etymology of the word. The word classic in music refers to a long, continuous tradition, timeless, with its own performance practice. Classical music is music that in general possesses the characteristics that can be described as classical. These are sets of qualities that work in opposition to romantic sets of qualities. In music history, we define the classical period as the style that dominated Western art music from about 1750 to 1820. For this reason, the compositions created during this period have come to be known as those belonging to the classical period. The classical style draws much of its characteristics from the style galant: clarity, simplicity, formal balance, naturalness. This is an example of mid-18th century architecture in Singapore. The classical aesthetic is marked by proportion and balance. Classical architecture was inspired by classical antiquity. Notice the simplicity, symmetrical units, long lines, and restrained ornamentation that characterize this style. Music in the classical period emulated these aesthetics. The music of this period centered on German-speaking countries, including the Viennese classical school. There are 4 composers who lived in or around Vienna between 1780 and 1828. This is something important. The group of composers who worked in Vienna during the 18th century are fondly known as the first Viennese classical school of composers. These were a group of composers that included Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. Schubert is the only classical composer who is genuinely Viennese, i.e., he was born there. We call them the first Viennese classical school because all of them worked in Vienna at the height of their careers. To give you a better context, let us take a look at where Vienna is. In the 18th century, Vienna was the capital city of the Holy Roman Empire. It was the 4th largest city in Europe then, an important place for aristocrats. Members of nobility settled there. Vienna was also a place where music thrived, and she was a melting pot of cultures. This is the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. Aristocratic patrons generally supported the best musicians in their personal capacity. They attended public and private music making in the concert hall, learned how to play music from music teachers, bought scores from music publishers. Generally, the audience was rather knowledgeable and appreciative of music. So here are examples of the cultural and social contexts where music making thrived during the classical period. On your left, you see the Mozart family, with Father Leopold holding his violin, Nanno, his sister, and Wolfgang Amadeus sitting at the clavier. Brother and sister are said to be playing the third movement from the Sonata in C, K19D. A likeness of their mother, who passed on a few years earlier in Paris, hangs on the wall. Leopold is shown with his violin and his quill to signify that he is both a musician and a writer. The figure Apollo in the background further emphasizes the musical nature of the Mozart family. Bottom left, you see an image of a piano trio used by the Viennese music publisher Artaria on several title pages during their mid-1780 publications. Unlike the string quartet, which was generally considered an all-male ensemble in the 18th century, the piano trio encouraged both males and females to make music together. On your top right, you see the Theater an der Wien, which was one of Beethoven's favorite concert venues. Today, Beethoven's memorial is displayed on its exterior wall. The text reads, Ludwig van Beethoven lived in the Theater an der Wien in 1803 and 1804. Parts of his opera, the Third Symphony, and the Kreutzer Sonata were written here. Fidelio and other works received their first performance in this house. So now let's listen to Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, which was premiered on 7th April 1805. What are the qualities that you should value in a performance of a composition belonging to the classical period? The word classicism is derived from the Latin word classicus. Classicus refers to classes in the Roman society, especially to the highest class, not only of people, but of things and achievements in many fields. High achievement ordinarily implies permanence of some kind, lasting values, and validity. High achievers, especially writers, have exemplary qualities worthy of imitation and emulation. Now let's take a look at several elements of classicism that characterize the works of mature Haydn and Mozart and of Beethoven. First, form is supreme over feeling. Music has a traditional method of arrangement in a sonata or a fugue. In the classical period, these forms are applied and given their full value. Second, form has an expressive quality that can move the listener and bring musical fulfillment to the listener. Expression is form in classical music because form has expressive qualities. The climate of music then was cool. Classical music shuns and avoids exaggeration or emotion. It understates or implies feeling, not wallowing continuously in it. The music was either abstract or absolute. Abstract or absolute music is music that doesn't refer to anything except the composer itself. It is dry, not illustrative, lacking in sensitivity. In the classical period, music is about itself, not directly about the composer or his life story. The composer generally remains detached and not related to the music. Classical music is normative or aspiring. Normative music conveys a particular expectation. It satisfies expectations and belongs to common tradition. It is not something unusual. Classical music is traditional in the historical and musical culture of its time. Each piece is not innovatory, not striving to advance beyond a previous work. Classical music expresses the precise age for which it is written. It doesn't cross boundaries. It is not concerned with writing for the future, and it is concerned with the state of the art. Music is socially and culturally reactive. It already exists, and you are just adjusting to it. Composers worked within guidelines not of himself, but of external forces. Classical composers generally did not set out to improve pieces, but to give intellectual satisfaction to their patrons. They would generally favor musical statements capable of being appreciated by everybody. Mozart would compose to gratify both ordinary music lovers and connoisseurs. For a work to have lasting appeal, a work of art must have universal qualities. This means that it must speak to us directly on a generally valid human level, and it must be timeless. Music in the classical period does not deny parallels with other arts, but emphasizes that techniques belong to music alone and not derived from other arts. For example, music lyrics cannot be substituted for another text. Music was international or cosmopolitan, not xenophobic or national. Music was moderate in scale, neither too long nor too short in length. Proportions were ideal. Classical things have to have the right balance. For example, sonata form usually has a proportionate development. Music was stylistically integrated and not eclectic. The movement and musical language were similar throughout the piece, with less stylistic contrasts than what you would find in Romantic music and after. Music reflected hierarchy. For example, the first violins, being a leader, would have the lion's share of parts. The distinction between sacred and secular music was still clear. Sacred music was still purposed with the liturgy and church in mind, and not a mere concert work. The sound was neutral. Classical music doesn't aim at being sensational. Technical demands were moderate. The classical concerto was difficult to play neatly. the classical sonata was easier than the romantic sonata. The classical composers gave vocal and instrumental music almost an approximate equality of appreciation in status. So we've come now to the end of the values of classicism. I'd like you to review all of these and tell me the top 3 factors that you value most in the classical pieces that you perform. In this section, I'd like you to think of 3 things that are unusual or anomalies or realities, or perhaps facts that we need to accept about the classical period. First, all 18th century is classical, despite important stylistic changes in the period between Handel and Haydn. The differences are mainly technical, and here contrasts are greater. This was a century that was commonly organized in a correlated plan known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was also called the Age of Reason, where man was pursuing truth, scientific advances, social justice, equality, tolerance, and freedom of speech. Second, it is also arguable that much of Beethoven and Schubert, although Viennese classical in a stylistic sense, is romantic in feeling and approach. This means that the Romantic movement in music predates their death in 1827 and 1828, respectively. Third, music is not really behind the other arts as far as classicism is concerned. 18th century music, whether late Baroque, Galant, or classical, is all classical in spirit and corresponds to Gibbon in historiography, Lessing in philosophy, Goethe in literature, Watteau and Davy in fine arts. So how true is this for you? I want you to reflect on any of these 3 points in various perspectives. What is your viewpoint? Do you think this claim is true, false, uncertain, and why? What would convince you to change your mind? Pen your thoughts in my learning portfolio.